The guilt of every suspect. Philip Dova's body was found after a phone call to the police. The call was made from the landline phone of the deceased's home, and the police officers were informed of the incident by the deceased in person. In the prosecution of crimes against life, they had to listen to the phone call many times and chat with those who knew Dovas, until they were convinced that the rough, uncouth voice they heard actually belonged to him. The victim described his death by giving specific instructions on where to look for evidence and who to arrest. Everyone who attended the Sunday dinner, 6 people in the number, friends, all guilty of premeditated manslaughter, according to his claim. He disliked those who taught him how to do his work. He heard the recorded call twice and ordered silence with a nod. Then he asked for a report from the crime scene. Philip Dovas called the police at 11:40 on the night of October 25, saying he was dead, and asked for a patrol car. At first the operator considered the call a farce, but the shot with which the stranger bade her farewell before hanging up the phone obliged her to inform the officer on duty. At 12:05 the officers arrived at Dova's residence. The front door was 2 fingers open. They entered the house and found the owner of the house dead in his bed, dressed in his old-fashioned pajamas, and with an expression of serenity that smoothed every wrinkle of his face. His body was still warm, more than the sweetest October sunshine would warrant. The first safe information of the forensic report referred to cardiac arrest. There were no signs of a struggle on his body or in the room, nor any indication suggesting criminal activity. In their brief conversation, the coroner was clear. If Dovas had been murdered, then the killer had chosen the mildest way of all to kill him, administering some toxic substance. But that took some days to confirm. Drimos agreed, nodding his head, and went out of the office. For the time being, he had to deal with 6 witnesses, who had already been dubbed suspects, and with the veracity of journalists. The story that circulated from the morning in all the editorial rooms and in the news bulletins was in itself a good catch, and contained in itself the raw material to create a human drama full of intrigue, dark secrets, and an untold treasure, the ingredients of the success of every form of fiction. The start was from the neighborhood, first with half-talk and innuendo, then with a vague reference to a treasure hunt, and at the end, complementing each other, neighbors, acquaintances, and journalists delivered to the television audience the script. The dead man had hidden in his house an untold treasure, something that to others was known as a rumor, while to some few as a certainty. Those who had supposed it were merely gasping at the thought of gold. Those who knew had every reason to commit the crime. And these were the 6 guests at dinner. Officer Grimm chose to ignore for the time being the large volume of testimony from unsolicited witnesses. He reached number 18 of a dead-end straight in the inn, and at first glance he agreed that the investigation would take longer than it took to investigate an apartment. The house of Philip Dovas was a 2 floors detached house with a graceless facade. The only feature of any other glorious grandeur was the 2 columns that flanked the entrance, gray and rough-looking like trunks of evergreens, with deep wrinkles, fine endings, like the capillaries of a wrestler, and asymmetrical creases and puddles at their bases. The house was built in a quiet neighborhood at the bottom of a street, from where one could distinguish the subway station on one side and Kalirwa Avenue on the other. As many hours as he stayed there, the only thing he could hear was the sound of a piano from an apartment in the opposite block of flats. The neighborhood was so quiet, and the ways of escape so few, that he was almost sure now that the work had been done from within, by someone who knew the victim. Maybe from a guest, but not from the 6, as the stranger on the phone claimed. Akramis detested every species of superstition and prejudice. For the moment, the identity of the man who had telephoned remained unknown, and until the number from which the call was made was identified, he was entitled, like everyone, to believe in his own conception, in simple logic. Crossing the threshold, the nobility and the sadness of old Athens awaited him. He could not hide his annoyance, as he lingered on the wide marble staircase, choosing his steps so as not to step on any of the objects that were lined up on the steps, small furniture, decorations, personal items that their owners would surely grieve to heaven if they saw them in such a way abandoned. Close to the maneuvers and the nails, which did not agree with his heavy appearance and made him feel ridiculous like a jester in a circus, the harsh had to face, and the heavy smell of glaze, which elsewhere outweighed and elsewhere was covered by that of mold. They both annoyed him equally, but the first for other reasons than the obvious ones accompanying every smell of rot. With this smell he lived his childhood. In every breath of glaze, in every faint caress of damp dust in his nostrils, there appeared before him, like lightning that flashed and all at once was lost in his mind, and a snapshot of his first life. The soiled wall, the heavy man's hand raised above the boy, the belt that descended with force on his back, the small room dark and cold as a cell, the steps outside the door, the voices, that they beat his ears and his senses, and made him forcefully tighten the pillow. Curled up under the rough woolen blanket, there, in his own deep darkness, he shook his head backward, ordering his mind to recover itself, and held his breath on the last steps. After pushing aside, softly, with foot a delicate chandelier, which Lord saw he had managed to survive after so many feet had passed over him, he turned to the top of the stairs and looked down. The spectacle was more fitting in a post-war documentary lamenting the destinies of humans. In the scanty light that streamed through the soiled windows of the front door and the 4 windows with the closed shutters, the grave man bade farewell to the corpses that filled the staircase and prepared himself for the worst. The vestibule of a house usually has the role of a prelude to what awaits the visitor inside. He turned again and looked for some switch on the wall to his right. The light was turned on by a switch that was in the most unsuitable spot, above the skirting board, in the little strip of wall that separated the 2 doors on the right, in the distance. Not by him, however, since opposite him, in the background of the little vestibule stood an old ragged man, who had certainly found a way of deceiving death and eluding it. If he should have guessed his age, the shrewd man would not have hesitated to reckon it more than 200 years, even though he knew that the man who welcomed him had only passed 90. His name was common but so characteristic that those who knew him only laughed at the idea that this sworn leftist was a namesake of the Greek dictator Papadopoulos. Those who respected his annoyance for this synonymy called him by the name of the resistance. They called him Semis. Old Semis was standing in a corner, resting his insignificant weight on a rifle which he held erect, with the barrel pointing upwards. His attitude reminded him of a warrior. He no longer feared or envied anything of the world. Sullen, with a permanent expression of dislike that darkened the eyes and held the lips, he measured from top to bottom the grim waiting for him to speak first. The uniform he wore still had on it the colors of war, fringes on the lapels and sleeves of the abijo, 2 holes and innumerable patches on the trousers, and everywhere dark stains. The old blood. If it wasn't for his reputation and that unicorn with the plain stock beside it, anyone would have thought that the uniform belonged to some other stout little fellow, with square shoulders and thick limbs, and not to this living carcass of a man. Drimos took off his official ID and held it before him out of habit, for he was sure that the old man could not even read the time on the pendulum behind him. He advanced 2 yards and waited for an answer to his greeting. He waited for him to finish, say what he wanted and get out of here. There was no need, of course, to say any of this. It was enough to read in his eyes both the contempt and the enmity, the hatred of every genuine leftist in every form of power. This one must be the last one, he thought grimly, and walked 2 yards more. She stood directly in front of him, with her hands in her pockets and with an insane desire to be silent. As if something were driving him away from this man, the duty of the policeman was obscured by his human nature. He didn't want to talk to him. He didn't even want to hear what he had to say, and all he could promise himself was to handcuff him at the slightest move he would make. The guy was not just obnoxious. He was definitely a graphic madman, who, if he was told that outside starts revolution again, he had nothing to belt the tanks for guerrilla war. Having managed to restrain the first words that came to his mouth, he flushed and tried to excuse his entrance. "I found the door open," he said, pointing down. "It's always open. She has no key, and we never shut her out," the old man replied, straining his throat like a Highlander. The man in the brown overcoat waited for the echo of the voice to be extinguished before he answered. "But you're in," he said. "Before you came, I was out. And you're not afraid of being robbed." Without taking his eyes off him, the old man drew back his body, holding motionless the hand that rested on the weapon. That was the answer. No words were needed to understand. He frowned, spreading his lips, and looked round. "May I see the place?" he asked, as if he had not understood the threat. The old man's face lighted up with a broad smile. His old limbs moved back and side, and his trunk leaned forward. "Of course, master," he said, and his voice dripped honey now. "This is the bedroom, next door the dining room, and opposite you the kitchen," he went on, and his skinny hand pointed listlessly to the doors. The dashing white shirt sleeve, ironed immaculately, was covered with a gold cuff link, which appeared through the wide sleeve of the army coat, along with a white light blue glove made with leather and imagination. On each finger was a date embroidered with thread. He read the thumb and the middle one. They were two dates from the years of the Civil War, back in 1946, which certainly meant something only for the one who wore this expensive leather ornament. For a moment he wavered what to believe. Mad or charlatan, what was this man? Drimos left psychology for later and chose the first door. The old man drew himself to the side to pass and followed him. The bedroom didn't fit in this house. It was clean and empty of furniture and belongings. Surely old Dovas only used it to sleep, since there was only a bed and a heavy curtain that kept out the midday sun. No bedside table, no wardrobe, no relics and vestiges like those he had encountered on the staircase. The old man passed the opening of the door, raised his right foot, and the light was turned on. Drimos turned and looked. The switch was at the same height as the one in the vestibule, 1 inch above the floor. She approached and bent over him. "For convenience, master," the old man replied, and the words came out in pieces as if in pain. "There used to be a knave living here," he added. Drimos looked at him without hiding his incredulity. He rose and approached the bed. In this wood monster with the stout legs and the non-existent headrest, Philip Dovas had found death. After gazing at it for some time, he lifted the coverlet, a heavy velvet garment, crimson, with fringes and laces, beginning at the edge. The mattress was bare, without sheets, and grated on the sides and corners, with an indistinct color, which in other places darkened like spring and elsewhere opened like blonde honey, when bees harvest the linden trees. And he was so sure of his parallelism, since the feeling left by the texture on his hand was the same as the caress of honey on the palate. Small and large patches with silky skin, irregular tesserae in all the shades that a beehive gives birth to, a mosaic that would be envied by many embroiderers. "Oh, old Dovas was a master I tell you. Oh," Semis explained with a stupid smile. The suspicion that this visit would lead nowhere had been circulating in his mind for a long time, and now that thought had settled in the middle and was spreading more and more. He nodded, in ignorance and despair, at what awaited him, and went out into the vestibule. The kitchen was the perfect place to quench one's thirst. There was a tap, which to his surprise was still working, and 2 glasses. The cabinets and shelves were filled with all sorts of irrelevant items, frames, decorations, ashtrays, postcards, and a bunch of useless trinkets. There was no furniture anywhere, and the forlorn visitor nodded again, agreeing with an expression of annoyance, with the voice within him that cheered and trumpeted that here dwells and reigns madness. What sort of conversation could one have with a man who keeps 50 years' worth of newspapers under the sink? It was the forbidden sheet, which had been released on April 21, 1967, and was immediately withdrawn from circulation. He spoke of the genitals with some caresses, while the verb, like the whole phrase, was the most popular curse of the Greeks, leaving clear hints of annoyance at the coup d'etat. Drimos dropped the newspaper on the marble of the sink and leaned again on the first stack. Between the worn edges of the newspapers, there was a thin white line that stood out from the others, a little higher than the middle. He picked up as many sheets as there were on top and pulled out the newspaper. It was this year, dated early January. He continued to search among the sheets of newspapers, and a few minutes later made sure that this find was the only one worth mentioning. No matter how many times he read its contents line by line, hours later, he could not find any reason to justify the existence of a communist newspaper sheet in the collection of a right-wing, a royalist, who kept sheets and clippings of right-wing newspapers until the day of Papandreou's political party victory in 1981. And strangest of all, he could not understand why he should be a leaf of this year. She cast a last glance at the coverlet she had left beside the sink and went out of the room, supposing that she had found, at last, the origin of the phrase history chronicle, which she had so often heard. Surely her inspirer had once stood in that room. He decided to finish at last by touring this museum of memories, and he thought that the ideal place to have that conversation for which he had come was the dining room. This time his hopes did not fall out. The dining room was definitely the only room that could accommodate normal people. In the center was a heavy table with 7 chairs, and a larger one of black leather at the head, flanked by a little furniture on 3 sides of the room and by some tables. Simple decoration, but equally divided between the old and the modern. Even the 40-minute plasma TV on the wall, which looked like an alien among the antiques and seascapes, bothered him less amused, indeed, even than he had seen heretofore. He sat down at the head of the table and waited for Semyonov to turn on the light with his foot. He advanced to the balcony door and drew the curtain. The room was lighted up to the middle, as the glare on the uncovered outside grew fainter and fainter, until it reached it, from the jungle of plants that thrived on the balcony. The old man got up and glanced there too, just enough to confirm his assertion. No one more untidy than a bachelor, except 2 of them. The occupants of the house used the balcony as a smoking room. The mosaic had been buried under dozens of cigarette butts, and nowhere, inside the house, had it smelled of nicotine. The plants had apparently accepted their fate and were living off each other. Braided together, they took advantage as they could of the plowing growth of an olive tree, which had joined forces with the branches of an ivy that had its roots in the road, and some of its branches managed to reach the balcony after years. Beneath the dense foliage of these 2 giants there was a little unseen world of weeds, little pots, tin cans and all sorts of pots, others full of soil and empty of life, some adorned with delicate, insignificant to the boy, plants. At one end he discerned 2 wooden chairs, whose duties were limited by the dense windings which had spread all around. It could but sit a squirrel, he soliloquized, or a mouse. He finished his thought and went in. Semyonov was waiting for him standing by the table, and his expression had softened by time. Without being sure, Drimos christened the moment appropriate, and entered at once into the matter. "Here is where you had dinner with your friends." "Yes, 6 were all of them, and me, 8 in total." Drimos pretended to agree with this method of addition logically. The 7th was Dova's. "And why do you count them separately from you?" "I am a communist, master. I fought, and Dova's fought but across from me. The others are all assholes." Drimos did not for a moment think of asking the meaning of the word in this man's tongue, and, for fear the conversation might be further diverted, he proceeded to the next question. "Were you here when Dova's died?" "I was asleep. I sleep downstairs. The upper house was his, the lower one was mine. We broke up. I only used the kitchen from the top floor, and he only used the front door from the bottom." Drimos nodded that he understood, and really had understood, the reason and manner in which chaos and nakedness coexisted under the same roof. "Okay, tell me exactly what happened that night," he went on, and left the Colt alone in his holster, putting his hand through his pocket. Semi's narrative added nothing more than what was stated in the police report and in the depositions. His manner, however, the arrangement he followed to describe the events, the people, this simplistic one-dimensional view of things in his poor mind, was enough for him to see from above the plan of what happened that night and to find the end of the story, which certainly needed a lot of effort and patience to get out of it. The way is often enough, and in a lie to distinguish the truth itself. Going down to the ground floor, he asked to see the grounds there. There were 2 rooms, that of Semi, a long storeroom with a cot wedged between shelves and all sorts of rubbish, and the drawing room which must have waited for years for someone to visit. If Greek furniture makers ever decided to build a history museum, this place would be ideal. There was furniture everywhere of every kind, most of it covered with sheets, crammed one upon the other. He accepted the challenge of his mind to go as far as the other end of the room, and admitted his mistake before he had even got there, when he turned the flashlight on his overcoat and saw that it was filled with a white powder. It was lime. Lime drives away dirt and vermin, master. He heard the squeaky voice behind him and whispered a swear word. The investigation did not pay off. There was nothing in the room but furniture, and surely no man had been there for months. There was no sign of recent human presence, nor did it take an affidavit to believe that the last person who had entered here had regretted it. The dust and the lime were giving their own fight, and Drimos had no reason to search further to ascertain who was winning the two. When he came out into the hall, he took a deep breath of relief and looked at his mess. The overcoat was filled with the white dust. He took it out carefully, folded it, holding it by the side of the lining, and peered into the glass of the entrance. He shook his hair with little blows and turned to the old man. "Where's the telephone?" he asked, and annoyance surged to his lips. Semi's walked up the stairs and pulled out, through a cardboard box that was on the first step, a black long-edged telephone device, one of the buttons covered by the headset. Drimos approached and lifted the gaze, moving it around. His thinking turned out to be correct. The phone call and the shooting had taken place here. The bullet had created a dark blot on the ceiling, about 6 feet above them. He stooped and took in his hands a piece of cement with a lime peel on one side of it. "Did you call the police?" he asked, and stood up, rubbing the piece into his palm. Semi's looked at him thoughtfully for a moment. Then the smile parted his lips and he said, "I never call them, master. Old Dovas wouldn't let go, and who should I call?" "Who called the police then?" "Only old Dovas knew the number. Only he, no one else. Let those bastards say whatever they will." Drimos turned his gaze toward the front door. He was vexed by all this hypocrisy in his tone of voice, and in his insolent face, which was constantly changing countenance and looking at him with a feigned servility. Looking more closely now, he noticed, behind an old bookcase, whole stacks of newspapers. He approached and drew one at random, then a second, then another and another, until he reached the halfway point of the first stack. He checked the others, hastily leafing through the leaves. All of them had dates of this year. They were sheets of the same left-hand newspaper that had stood out among the kitchen doorsteps. Without speaking, he climbed the ladder as fast as he could and returned after a while, holding the sheet of the 4th of January. "You support it, I see, the party," she said, pointing to the stacks with the sheet she had brought from the kitchen. "Oh, me, not me, master. Old Dovas. Old Dovas used to take them one every day." "A right-handed man and a radical subscriber. Are you kidding me, pap?" "Oh no, master, no. God damn it, no. See for yourself." Semi's replied and ran to a pile of scrap metal and glassware. "See for yourself. This one came today," he said, pulling out a newspaper inside nylon packaging. Drimos read Dova's name and home address on the label with the recipient's details. He flushed his face and threw the newspaper over the others. As he turned around on his axis, pretending to be staring at the stacks of cheap antiques, his mind was trying to think of just one, the most absurd, even reason to explain Davos' interest in left-wing journalism. Then he turned toward the sitting room, put on his flowered overcoat again, and entered the furniture museum. Holding the flashlight with his teeth and with nervous movements, he managed to distinguish several more stacks of sheets of the same newspaper, all of past years, under the sheets or inside furniture. If he knew what to look for, he was willing to pick it all up himself and find what he sought. But for the moment, he did not know what he was asking. All the way back he would recap over and over again what the old madman had told him, looking to find a hole, as he used to call every contradiction, every inaccuracy, anything that he considered inaccurate, ambiguous, or worthy of investigation. The facts were so few and concrete, and they were so. At 8:45 the first guests arrived, carrying the dinner of the group which they had bought from a steakhouse in the neighborhood. They were Messaris, Sergos and Halaris, sons of two Dovas, fellow soldiers in the Civil War. Soon after the three dirges came, as Semis insisted on calling them. Stilas, Macris, and Sampanis were three penniless mutts, who played the collectors and dealers of old objects and who had met the old men in the cafe and had been circling them for a couple of months now. Day and night, from Monday to Monday, and they kept coming, master. I told the dotage not to put them in the house. They had a bad purpose, to steal, and don't let me tell you they've been lying about something. I haven't seen those records of Cottons in days. Drimos clearly remembered these words and the way they were spoken. Without confidence, with despair and a little distrust, as people spoke a century ago, when they charged a fellow man with some pity, after they had first struggled to find another explanation. Last of all and late, Hercules arrived. No one knew his last name, although he was introduced to it everywhere, claiming that he was linked by a blood bond with a well-known post-war politician, the same as the bond he had with his uncle. Dovas never objected to this assertion, but he looked as if he feared it. "He was trembling, I tell you, master," the other said, and the old man, who was a fair beast and lifted no man's foot, bowed his head. "This one, you see, is a mole, an agent. Oh, Dovas had talks with those English guys in the war, see where he has a file for it. Hercules knows a lot about Dovas, he knows a lot. He told him so before us once." Somewhere over there, the man got tired of jotting down gibberish and closed the notebook. The rest he remembered as if he heard it now. When they were all seated around the table, Dovas got up, closed his eyes, and prayed aloud. He thanked God for bringing them together. Semis was sitting opposite at the other head of the table, giggling, muttering songs of the gorilla. Then they began to eat. Every now and then, one of them would drop a word about the food, the weather, the politics. No one was opening a conversation, and they were all staring at each other. "But I know what they were thinking, master." "What were they thinking, Semis?" "They were thinking when they were going to kill the old man, and how they were going to find out the number." "The number?" "Of the police. I told you only Dovas knew him." After they had eaten and drunk and sung and told stories of the war, Dovas his own, the others what they knew of their fathers and what they put down their heads, Hercules went out into the vestibule and brought to the table that box which he kept when he came. They were chocolates, 8 chocolates, Belgian pralines. Everybody knew how much Dovas loved chocolates, master. Anyone who came home to buy something would trade it for chocolates. Hercules opened the box and offered one to Chalaris, then to Sergo, then to the 3 bastards, and there were 2 left. He leaned in front of me and let me choose. Then Dovas sprang from his seat and snatched up both the chocolates and swallowed them. "You don't have to eat, you're old," he said, and they all burst out laughing. "And when did Dovas call the police?" After, long after. It would be midnight, I don't know. When the company had drunk all the wine, 3 bottles of the pound one by one, the guests began to leave. Dovas was complaining of a chest pain, but no one took his words seriously. When the 2 were left, Semis went down to his room and lay down. Soon after he heard footsteps and voices from the staircase, but he paid no attention. Those mutts used to go halfway to the table when the liquor was over, and to come back after a while with another bottle to go on. He was not sure, but it must have been the voice of Hercules that cried and hummed. He turned and slept, and his sleep was sweet, heavy, dreamless. In his first encounter with the 6 suspects, Dribble didn't have to say much. He didn't even have to score much, though. Their statements agreed in everything with what he already knew, and more importantly, he was unable to discern any motive or other incriminating evidence in anyone. Sergos worked in the Ministry of Culture, and Halaris had retired early, with a large degree, from the Air Force. Both of them were family men and descendants of warriors of the Albanian front. The other 3 were indeed rebels, people of gambling and abuse, living at the expense of others, petty scammers, tricksters of €10. Hercules proved to be a tougher nut, but in the end he broke and gave his full resume. A phone call from Vice helped with that. Despite his impressive appearance and eloquence of speech, he was never able to become a luxury gigolo. His victims were confined to the middle class, and he would surely be proud of the only worthwhile trick he could do, when he persuaded a diplomat's wife to trust him €150,000 to erase her husband's name from the headlines the next day, which characterized him as the initiator of a scandal with plenty of zeros in the end. Before all this, and in his youth, he sold protection to prostitutes and infamous downtown hangouts. He remembered when he read all the nicknames in his file: Astrite, Vulture, Baidlas, Charles for his expensive outfit and his obsession with speaking to everyone in the plural, and a bunch of heavy names to escape or impress. Ending with him, he was left with the same question. What reason had 2 respectable citizens and 4 rascals to murder an old man who lived in a dump, surrounded by junk and junk? First, he had to make sure the verb. Had Dovas actually been murdered? The forensic service replied after 2 days. The body of the dead man had detected a quantity of ricin, capable of killing. The time of death was reckoned between 10 and 11 o'clock at night. The victim received the poison from the mouth, along with a small amount of chocolate. Drimos swallowed and tried to hide his annoyance about what it foreshadowed. A game of hidden treasure, a search for unseen clues, one of those cases of deception that one meets only in police novels. There were few times when he was confronted with seemingly unsolved crimes, and when he was forced to resort to the methods of the English detectives of the 20th century. He suffered since he was forced to admit that every inconsistency, every element that proved correct against logic, required a whole chain of research mathematical methods. He always hated induction, in all its forms, and analytical thinking that abstained from his favorite tactic, the study of people, the famous psychology. Here psychology was useless. The 6 guys, whether they were telling the truth or not, were not connected in any way with Dovas, never had financial dealings with him, did not expect or owe anything to him, and, most importantly, each of them knew him only a few months or weeks. Taking advantage of all the means afforded to his rank and reputation, he continued his search for their past, and the only indirect evidence of connection he could find between them and the dead man was disheartening. They were insignificant. All of them had met Dovas in seemingly random ways, in some coffee shop in the center of Athens, or in one of their frequent walks in Userum, next to Monastiraki Square, which the old man used to be every Sunday morning, selling some of the junk he had found. In fact, Chalaris and Hercules had each bought something: a crystal ashtray with red reliefs of ancient Greek decorations on the side, and a handmade flute with carved 2 verses from the famous Erotikritos poem on it. It is of no value. I bought it because I was stuck by the old man who sat so long on his bench and made a mess, Hercules explained. Sergos had a most interesting story to tell. He met Dovas one afternoon in an alley under the church of Asamaton. The old man was pushing his cart into the road and stopped to take a look inside a rubbish bin. Sergos drove by in his car, hit the cart, and the road was filled with trinkets and junk. Dovas began to shout and swear. To avoid the episode, Sergos gave him €20 and promised to bring the remaining amount of damage to the house the next day. He had no more money on him. This accident was the occasion for them to meet. Dovas passed in the mountains of Pindos Mountains in Albania, and the stories Sergos had heard from his father about the same places brought them together. The 50-year-old man visited the old man almost every day, bringing him a plate of food, a bottle of wine, and his father's stories from the front. There in the mausoleum of old Dovas, filled with memories and useless mementos, sat the two of them three, when he happened to meet with Hercules, four when he deigned their company and Semizen communed, old wine on draught and forgotten stories. The other three were a team. Together they had come to safety, together they had met Dovas, together they had visited him once in a while. All three of them were introduced as colleagues, scavengers, antique dealers, appraisers of human nature, and all the overseers. They talked a lot, complimented each other, and listening to them, one would say rehearsed every performance they gave. The first time Drimos received them all three together in his office. If there had been a fourth, he would have bet that the Dalton brothers had left descendants in Greece. The tall man had the part of an idiot and played it just as well as the short man, who cut and sewed his mouth and brain, and it was he who directed the conversation. The midfielder did the vocals, usually repeating the words of others, when stuttering let him speak. All three of them have known Dovas for years, but have hung out with him in recent months. He summed it up, a bevy of mismatched people sitting around a table. The two have nothing to do with the world of lunatics, interlopers, and outcasts. They eat, drink, frolic, enjoy their dessert, and a few hours later, one of them, the host, falls dead from intoxication. And now it is I who must believe all this trifle and look for the murderer, is it not? He finished his thought and looked meaningly at the non-commissioned officers who were listening. No, one wondered just to say something. If the law gave me the right, I'd lock them all up until the guilty man speaks. He looked at his flock, who watched absorbed. Better still if none of them spoke. They would rot inside, he continued. None of his associates asked for an explanation of this gravity. The constable's outbursts had taught them the value of silence. They remained silent, while the grim distributed jobs and responsibilities, welcomed one by one the coat of arms, and walked away. The scoundrel had a plan to dig out the lie, if there was, of course, a lie, but he preferred not to share his suspicions for the time being. He had been convinced, by that strange way in which Semi spoke to him, that the story he had heard from him and from the other six was but a trifling aspect of a well-hidden truth, which no one cared to learn. All of them confined themselves to the typical nonsense that accompanies the death of each person. All showed a zeal for trivial details when describing the night of the murder. Really, who cares how well the food was cooked and what story Dovas chose to tell from the early 40s? And they all fell silent when the officer mentioned the murder weapon, the chocolates. No one pretended to know, but no one seemed to know. All were astonished, and half were cross that they had not chosen the wrong morsel. Like any old-fashioned detective, Drimos always used to take notes, whether it was a visit to a crime scene or a lyricism with a witness. Now he had before him pages full of gibberish, from which he had to choose what to keep and what to erase. He grappled again with what Semis had told him. This fellow, so exceedingly mad and picturesque to be true, was most likely to be the culprit. He was servile. He was a flatterer with those he could not deal with, but he would not lose the opportunity of striking his enemy in the back. He envied people. No, he did not envy them. He hated them, and he did not conceal it. He was tougher than his appearance showed, and he underestimated the value of human life. He was referring to Dovas' death as if he were talking about the most normal event in the world, and did not hide his interest and joy that the 6 culprits would rot in prison. "What makes you think they're all 6 guilty?" he had asked shrewdly at the time. Their eyes, master, the way they looked at him. They had come to kill him, I tell you. What for? There are so many ancient objects here, so many old ones. Do you want a better reason? There is you too, though, the shrewd replied, and waited to see him fall into the trap. Me, I have nothing. I am a guest, and one of these days I must go. The house belongs to another man now. Who? But to the murderer and his accomplices. They told me plainly, you've got a weak Semis or else, and he drew a line over the throat with his hand. Drimos noted and counted. How many points of honesty and how many of madness were gained by these words? Surely the old man was playing some game. He may have lost his mind long ago, but when he talked about Dovas and them, his eyes lit up, glistening from the effort to play his part well, not to forget something he had rehearsed, and to balance right on the fine line between madness and hypocrisy. He made sure of this when the conversation went on for a while in the bygone years of the war, and his voice narrowed, lowered, and hid behind his heavy breath, which testified to annoyance and discomfort. All that scherzo and brio of the madman, the lack of reason and consciousness of those who lose their senses, were gone. His words, his manner of speaking, his look betrayed his annoyance, just like someone who doesn't want to remember, or as someone who doesn't remember reacts. "Keep that last one," he soliloquized, and left the smoke of his cigarette on the desk. By the time he was in the coroner's office, his mind had cleared of all manner of doubt. It was a thought, a theory that had preoccupied him from the moment he spoke to the old man, yet he had no evidence to support it. When he saw Dova's body, he took the first yes, the dead man agreeing with his theory. Now he had to find some proof, and there was only one clue left to look for: the sheet of newspaper he had found in the kitchen. After reading and rereading what was inside, he singled out only one point, a small, insignificant text on one of the last pages. It made no sense, nor could he claim to have found the piece of the puzzle he lacked, yet there was one who could give him an answer to it. The answer from the publisher arrived at his office the very same day. Along with this, he received 5 sheets of the form, each with a different date. He made room for his desk, opened them, searched and found what he thought was in each, and smiled meaningfully over the last sheet. It was the same sheet he had found in Dova's kitchen cupboard. It was the proof he needed to make sure. Now he had to figure out how to handcuff the culprit. He nodded, not from doubt, but from certainty anymore, to the challenge that lay before him. The murderer of Philip Dovas was not a particular man. It was early December when the 6 men gathered in the office of the constable. The truth is, they were all waiting to be greeted by the captain in person, and not by 2 non-commissioned officers who seemed to take no interest in their presence. When indeed, Hercules and Halaris insisted on learning the reason of this assemblage, they received only deprecatory smiles. Drimos had given definite instructions, more than an hour's waiting, and without explanation. As old-fashioned as this method seemed, the heads of the Greek police preferred it to other methods of psychological violence. "The captain is in a meeting with the lieutenant, and will see you as soon as he has finished." The answer was given with the timbre characteristic of the voice of one who knows something important and rather unkind to the listener. At first none of the 6 thought of such a thing, but as the minutes passed, enclosed within the gray walls of an office that no one visited for good cause, psychology played its role, the familiar game of self-suggestion, and every seemingly irrelevant image or conversation that caught their eyes and ears from the whispers of the 2 policemen was a sign, a solid proof of the danger that lurked them, and from moment to moment would cross the threshold of the door, and the case would lock. With her would lock a pair of handcuffs or 6, because they were all guilty, and if they weren't, they looked guilty. They knew and were prepared for this critical hour long ago, and had spent countless hours in the mirror each, rehearsing style and words, when that moment would arrive. Well, the crucial hour had arrived, and it was now that each of them would find out if all this game was worth it. They looked at each other once or twice, agreeing with their eyes to endure, not to step back, no matter what they hear, no matter how much they fear, and then spent all the time left until the door opened, focused, with the look of perseverance and valor, on the void in front of them, as if they had taken the heaviest oath of their lives, like the dying who do not witness even the last moment when the firing squad. Entering the office, Drimos found them in this attitude, and Hercules alone quieted his gaze and rose to greet him. He motioned to his men to pass out and began to close the blinds in the windows. The office darkened, and with it the eyes of those who had been watching this unexpected development. Passing by them, Drimos asked them to turn towards his desk at the far end of the room and stood behind them by the door. The bare wall was illuminated, and the yellow light of the projector's lamp blurred, filled with spots and wrinkles, and from its dull color were born images. They were scenes of war, chariots and people perched on the mountains, grasses that covered dead and heroes, ruins and sullen faces of people. So a few minutes passed. The view was cut short, and the image froze into the footage of a house about to collapse. The office was flooded with fluoride light. The Civil War, the voice of the dreamer was heard as if it were a great discovery. This film was entrusted to me by a friend from a source not very well known in the world, but I'm sure you all recognize the place. Right. The six men looked at each other for a moment. This here is the Battle of Diakos. He paused and waited to see their reactions. No one spoke, but from the way in which they looked at him, he could be sure that they understood more than their faces showed. You know the deacon, don't you? Well, when I heard the story, I could not understand why the name of a grocer who lived in a village in Pindos was given in a battle. Then I thought of the worst, the feud, the hatred that doesn't fade sometimes in people's breasts. And of course the pounds, 3,000 pounds golden from England. He made the round of the hall, opening the blinds one by one, and sat down at his desk. Today we will talk about these pounds. I don't suppose you think the pounds have been found. They haven't been found, and they won't be found, as it seems. The reason for your present presence has to do with the only person who could enlighten us on this. Now that this man is not alive, things are more difficult for you. There is no motive, no perspective, you see. In short, there are no pounds left for you. You'd better talk then and get it over an hour later. Sergos reacted first. Are you threatening me? He said, as he needed his voice to convince himself that he was not afraid. No, Mr. Sergos. I'm threatening all six of you. There may be only one culprit, but the court will have no difficulty in understanding and locking you all up for complicity. I'm not going to talk without my lawyer, Halaris said, and pulled out his cell phone. Of course. Besides, I think he's expecting your call any minute. Before you came here, you were in his office. Are you watching me, sir? I watch everybody, from the first day. You all had your personal following, and you all did what you had to. Low profile, conservative life, mild manners, work home, a walk to the cafe for the three gentlemen there in the gallery, he said, pointing to the three rebellious who sat behind Sergos, Halaris, and Hercules. You have done just as much as you ought to do to arouse no more suspicion. The crime may have been committed, the way may be obvious, even the culprit may be obvious, but... Here, let me bow and smile. The plan was so well staged, no one would believe it was murder. It must have taken you a long time to make up all this theater, he said, turning his head slightly aside as if to speak to them and to the wall behind him. He got up and leaned forward, resting his weight upon the desk. I'll tell the story once, the story you all know. Then I'll wait for you to confirm it. The deposits you give will be signed. This is your only chance to fall as softly as you can. Hercules smiled, emphasizing his contempt with a muffled grunt through his teeth. Otherwise you will be forced to listen to things you do not know, Drimos continued, and irony left faces and lips. You are the chief, I understand, he continued, taking 2 steps over Hercules' head. Only parties and groups have leaders, he replied, ready again to retaliate with irony. Drimos returned to the office and consulted his notes. Well, the strangest thing about this story is the arrogance of you all, the certainty of fooling so many people. Before you were even sure Dovas was dead, you walked into his bedroom and started emptying it. I'm sure if Semis went up to see what was going on, you'd kill him too. All the trouble, all the searching, all the dragging up the stairs for nothing. I will be brief. Film you just saw was taken by an Englishman during the Civil War. It describes what the inhabitants of a small village in Pindos saw after a conflict between the government and the rebels. That battle was never named. It is not recorded in any file and is remembered only by those who were there then. So no one. It was not done for the sake of any strategic point, nor for tactical reasons. The men who fought in that village were looking for something very specific. For a treasure. Right. Silence gave him the right to go on. It all began by a mistake. A false drop by the British Air Force. The pounds that Zervas expected fall on the wrong side of the mountain where the rebels are. The one who finds them is a resident of the village named Diakos. The governesses learn it and torture him to speak. He doesn't tell them where he keeps them hidden. But war can't wait. Zerva's men are transferred elsewhere and history is temporarily forgotten until the Civil War. Then, in one of the last movements of troops before the final battles, 7 men from the government army, who knew the history of the pounds, leave their company and go to the village. Diakos is on the mountain with the rebels. The 7 men burn down his house and torture his children and wife. Someone's warning the rebels. It is decided to descend to the village Diakos alone to save the place from the worst. They say in those parts that this man was a 4-legged man. Before he could reach home, therefore, he had laid out his plan. After he had hidden the treasure, the very day he found it, he had made a map with his own coordinates. He counted steps, the shadows of trees, and set signs that do not fade with time. Having memorized them, he burned the paper and waited for the war to pass. When he was notified of the fate of his people, he thought that the only way to escape both he and they was to share the information on the map with the government. It took him some beating and several hours to persuade them to listen to him. The 7 men believed that Diakos was guarding the treasure somewhere in the house, and after tearing down and breaking what they could, they rose and fled, pursued by the rebels who had learned what had happened, and descended the mountain in arms. As if he had reckoned on the game which fate would play him, Diakos had taken care to share his secret with them equally. He whispered in the ear of each and every one of them, telling them that thus they would all have a share of the share. In those years no one trusted anyone. Having taken the evidence, the 7 pulled for the mountain. Following Diakos' instructions, they found themselves in a large clearing. Then they understood the game he had played them, but it was too late. Because the clearing, described by the 7th element, was so big, a small plain, that it would take a lifetime to search it inch by inch. They returned to the village enraged, but Diakos had already fled with the rebels to the mountains. His wife and their 2 children were inside the house when the flames engulfed it. As soon as they were thrown out, shots were heard, and all 3 of them fell dead. But let us leave this story aside. After all, you more or less know all this. Let us come to the present. He pulled out a cigarette and with that held out his hands. The truth is, I had a hard time understanding why anyone would want a 90-year-old scavenger dead. The crime was incomprehensible even as to the method employed. It was executed in such a carefully sketched manner that it was evident that behind the obvious proofs of guilt there was something else concealed. But what? Here, I admit, the conversation with Mr. Papadopoulos played an important role. The 6 men looked at him in wonder. With semis, of course, he explained. The people say from a small and from a crazy. Semis proved to me that he had no part in the crime, probably did not know the danger his friend was in. But if anything, what he told me was only what he knew and had seen. It's not about the facts so much as the way he was describing. He was talking, and I wondered why I sat listening to this madman, but his manner emboldened me to listen to him. You know, sometimes, by the most trivial utterance of the word, a door opens which to a man in the dark is but a promise, a hope. So easily despair of the cops, Hercules sneered. But I don't speak for myself. I'm talking about Dova's. 6 pairs of eyes darkened, and 6 minds turned to the same thought, danger, something far away that had been unknowingly present, and which now had taken them in pursuit and lurked behind their footsteps. Sergos turned back and looked at the 3 other, then his gaze stood on Hercules, who was staring as if he were halfway through an equation that remained unsolved. I had to pay attention to all that Semis told me. Lies, 3 words, but let's leave the dead alone for now, huh? Apart from the fact that there is no sense in this, since no one calls to announce his murder before he dies, there is also that matter of the phone. He paused and waited to see what had happened. The 6 men stared at him as if hypnotized. I mean, Semis mentioned something that, if I hadn't tried him, I wouldn't have believed. He told me that only Dovas knew the number to call the police. Follies, follies of an old fool, that's what anyone would imagine. Trying, however, to summon myself from the apparatus of the house, I was forced to admit that the old man was right. Calling 911 couldn't do anything. Actually, calling any number wouldn't work. Okay, one could argue that this particular device is broken, and that amid the so much junk that the old people were collecting there would be a second phone device, to be used by someone who wanted to call. Unfortunately for you, no second device was found in the house, and yet the call to the police came from Dova's house. There goes that. The six suspects looked at each other in wonder. Let us go to Semyonov's second conversation, which struck me, the reference to the treasure. A fine bluff, though a risky one, for when one has nowhere to go to look, one gets caught by the first foolishness one hears. Treasure. The house is full of rubbish and unimportant antiques. Even if there was something hidden in there, Dovas couldn't have left it adrift in the hands of the first person. I'm not hiding from you that, for a moment, I thought I'd call a crew with scouts and search the place. But when I saw that sheet of the Radical among the Philistine papers, and when I saw the rest in the hall and in the drawing room, I understood that the story and the treasure, if there was one, was going far, far back in time. And perhaps I should have understood that from the beginning, if I had taken seriously that madman, the military, and the rifle he held in his hand. I had then to understand the characters, the intentions, the relation between them. For all of you, I didn't give a shit. Since the poison was found, since Dovas swallowed it along with the chocolate, and since the sweets were brought by you, he said, looking at Hercules, you are the culprit and the rest of your accomplices. You are mistaken. I brought the box sealed just as I bought it from the confectioner's. Yes, you are right. The store clerk in Semis confirmed that. You were trying, he says, for some time to untie the ribbon, and in the end you cut it with a knife. So it is exactly, Halaris interjected. We all saw that. Of course, and you all picked candy first. The last two left for the old men, however, he ate them. That's what all six of you forgot to mention. A whisper was heard and some sat down in their seats. I don't know yet whether Semis made a blunder in telling me, or knew and wanted to open my eyes. When the forensic results came out, the thing was lantern light. It was a crime, it was premeditated, and it certainly had nothing to do with the treasure. This time the whispers became voices. Yes, I know that something like this upsets the entire case file, since the most basic element of the investigation is broken down. He pointed with his gaze to the frozen shot of the ruined village house against the wall. There's no motive, he said, and lit his cigarette. If your motive was treasure, then I can guarantee you that you managed to lose the last of the 8 elements, once and for all. Why, Dovas knew very well what awaited him, and what he wanted he accomplished, to take the secret to his grave. You have an entirely wrong conception of things, Captain, Hercules said. No one wanted Dovas dead, and since his death came from poisoning, you should have turned against the one who made the sweets, for criminal negligence. He smiled and prepared to answer through his smoke, but he was overtaken by the words of the other. There are 6 witnesses who will confirm that the box was opened before them, and that each chose at random from a candy. By chance, yes. You know, I hate that word. She's very easygoing and belittles people every time someone mentions her. I wonder, by chance he subscribed to a left-wing newspaper, an old stubborn King Friendly. Was it by chance? Did you all know that his secret is hidden somewhere in the house, and you wear that trying to talk to him for months? Was it by chance that he found his room completely empty, when the whole house resembles a junk shop? And was it by chance that he called the police to report his death? You know, even luck gets tired and abandons those who constantly rely on it. Yours certainly has been welcomed. He walked once round the room and stood before them. So be it, since you would rather have a life sentence for something you didn't do, let's finish an hour earlier. What you hear is evidence of the case file that will be sent tomorrow to the office of the competent prosecutor. And it's just the facts. July 11, 2000. George Papadopoulos, which is Semis, knocks on the door of Dova's house. He has just read an ad in the newspaper, asking for contact with anyone who knows anything about the Battle of Diakos. Dovas does not believe his ears when he hears that Diakos is before him in person. Semis shows him both identities, his own and the one he took after the Civil War, when he left his village, the identity of George Papadopoulos. He tells the story and shows him what marks have been left on his body from the torture of the seven. Dovas obviously doesn't believe what he's hearing. He put up an ad, hunted by remorse, trying to find Diako's trail, and instead of someone who might have some information, he finds his own victim in person. He falls at his feet and asks for forgiveness, although he knows that his repentance will not bring back the dead, nor will it pacify the soul of the man who looks at him from above. Semais accepts his apology, but on one condition: to help him find and take revenge from the other 6 of the group of tormentors. Dovas hesitates. He knows they're all dead. Semais also knows this. He also knows that for years some of their children have plowed Greece to find if Diakos confided his secret to someone, the 8th clue that leads to the treasure. And the 8th element mentions the steps that a person must take from the beginning of the clearing, where the mountain path ends, to dig. Way then there is for revenge. What could be better than a bait of £3,000 England? Dovas reacts at first, but he cannot fail to admit that the punishment that Semais asks for is completely justified. The 6 men, 6 of the children of Diako's torturers, have been trying for decades to find a treasure, for which their fathers committed 4 horrible crimes. They killed a mother with her 2 children and tortured a man they did not know and had not harmed them, when the war was almost over and in those places a truce was declared. Hubris. I think that's the word Semais used, and Dovas was convinced. The plan has been in the rebels' mind for years. He doesn't just want to kill them, he wants to give them the hope most precious to them, the certainty that they know all the details of the map, and then the brute pretended to cut his throat, and tall Dalton jerked back. The first thing to be done was to find a home to stay with. Dovas' house was a 2-room apartment, not made for their plan. Dovas had that old house in the New World, an inheritance from an uncle with oddities and disabilities, in which he never cared, since he had neither children nor cared any more to live life. His remorse and cowardice to find Diakos all these years had made his mind mad. He lived like a wild beast and fed on garbage. His house had no electricity, and everything he made from begging he drank. Semais offered him, for a while, the life he didn't live. They moved into the old house, and both began to work like old-timers, thus getting out a plate of food. Nobody in the neighborhood knew them, and those we asked told us about 2 crazy old men who used to stir up the world every now and then with their quarrels and by, carrying all sorts of junk. The profile of the 2 lunatics was successfully built. No one cared for them, no one cared on their behalf. That's when the ads started coming into the paper again. But time went on, and nothing happened. The 6 treasure hunters either did not read the papers or paid no attention to the advertisement. Then Semais decided to run things a little. He sent an anonymous letter to each, indicating the place where the 8th clue was hidden, the house in the New World, stating that the old man who lived there was mad and alcoholic, and that if they gained his confidence, they could freely enter the house until they found it. To convince them, as a postscript he wrote the 7 particulars which he had once confided to Dova and their fathers. The recipients are convinced. Drimos turned and looked at the 6 suspects one by one. The best bait, don't you agree? Who could have suspected the plot? There was only one problem to solve: the identity of Semais. He could not, of course, tell them that he was Diakos, nor claim that he had any direct connection with the story, but Dova's profile and the conversations of his neighbors convinced the 6 gold diggers that he was an alcoholic who talks a lot when he drinks. Semais was supposed to have learned about the treasure on a hangover. He met the 6 men in a cafe and asked in return for a fair share. To extinguish the last suspicion, he claimed that the old man in the house was Diakos himself, showing them the identity, his own identity that now represented someone else. And this is where the theater begins. The 7 of them are supposed to find a way to get to know Dovas and earn his trust. Of course, they can't all go home together and introduce themselves with their real facts. Not everyone, anyway. Some get acquainted with him by chance, others by another ad. Semais has planned everything to perfection. When the 6 men visit Dovas' house, they are 100% convinced that the old man is telling the truth. They see the stacks of Rizesti's cards. What more natural for a romantic left than to be written in the most historical form of his faction? For decades, the work of the scavenger has its perks, or, to be more precise, it gives access to the strangest places. As in the archive of a late communist, whose children do not even want to see the piles of newspapers left to them in memory by their father. Semis confided to me that it took him 2 weeks to carry, with his cart, whole stacks and cardboard boxes, until he emptied the house behind the Calamar Maro Stadium. It is all that you saw in the Dova's house. I think I have talked too much, let me cut it short. Let us come to the fateful evening, after we have first agreed that, in the course of time, the 6 of you gained the old man's confidence by passing at home many nights with food, with wine, and with tales of the war, until the conversation reached the deacon's treasure. Then Dovas spoke, for the first time, of the 8th element. The 8th item is in the house, yet even a drunkard pays attention to his words when he refers to something as large as 3,000 pounds. There was no alternative for you. You could not wait for when a word would escape him or when he would die to search freely. So his death was decided. Of course, this was helped by semis who encouraged your plan, the chocolate poisoning. The trick was a simple one, and I can say that I understand why the cleverest of the company, along with the idiots, were persuaded, he said, pointing with his eyes at the tall and middle Dalton. From then on came what we have said, what you had agreed to be. You ate, you drank. The Lord opened before you the box and began to offer first to you, to his friends. I don't know which one of them made the change, took a clean dessert and put in its place the one with the poison. What I don't understand is how you are so sure that semis would choose the right dessert between the two that the 2 old men are left to choose. The 6 men looked at each other. The question sounded like a mockery, and it was a wonder how a man who had unmasked the double game of 8 would-be assassins would meet obstacles with his thought in something so simple. Tall Dalton undertook to explain. Why, after we had conspired, as you said, to kill Dovas, and to search the house to find the clue. Besides, Dovas was the deacon. He was a lefty, and he did everything left. We knew that of the 2 chocolates he would choose the left, added short Dalton, and leaned back in the chair. Drimos sank into his chair and took the stupidest look he could. Yes, yeah. Then why did semis tell me that Dovas was in the right? The last word sounded like a curse, and those who understood felt their powers forsake them. Sergius collapsed first. What do you say? Why, yes, I thought you knew. Captain, I think you've lost it. Dovas picked a candy bar. In fact, he didn't choose, but he took them both. Semis didn't have time to eat out of the box. Yes, yes, you are right, Drimos replied and got up from his seat. He walked to the door, opened it, and beckoned. 6 plainclothes officers entered the office. They approached the 6 and handcuffed them. Before anyone had time to speak, his voice had returned to its familiar pallor. Gentlemen, you are under arrest for the murder of George Papadopoulos, the so-called semis. Of your legal rights, as well as of your representation by a lawyer, you will be informed by colleagues. One after another, the 6 men were found standing and handcuffed. Wait a minute, Sergos shouted. What are you talking about, Papadopoulos who? But Papadopoulos is semis and semis is alive. Dovas is dead, Dovas. Mr. Dovas, will you do us the honor? Drimos raised his voice harshly. At the opening of the door, semis appeared, dressed in an expensive black suit. Mr. Dovas, or Mr. Diakos, or Mr. Papadopoulos, or Semi, or whatever your name is, will you give us the explanations? Dovas approached Sergos. Your father and I extinguished our cigarettes on this man's body, he said. Then he approached Hercules. He was the one who shot his wife and children along with those who gave birth to these bastards, he said, pointing to the 3 Dalton men. When he saw Halaris, his gaze softened. Mine did the least harm, I think. He burned the house, he said, and his lips pressed one upon the other. Drimos stood behind him. I didn't mean to go so far as to investigate the story. I was satisfied with this man's confession and what he testified about the night of the crime. There were, besides, other ways of talking if I wanted to. He asked me, however, to be here today. Diakos and I agreed to change identities in the new house. Everyone thought Semi's was me and Dova's was him. He played his part well. I, for one, have not been able to deceive you, she said, looking at him sternly. You are extravagant in your manners, sir. The uniform, the gloves, the chatter. So be it. I'm an accomplice anyway. I could have stopped him before he ate the candy, and I didn't. But that was also part of our agreement, that he should die and that his murderers, the seeds of his enemies, should be put in prison. I didn't have kids. I think then that I am left alone to keep the debt. He stretched out his hands and waited for the handcuffs. He motioned to one of his men to lead him out of the office. Behind them followed the others. Wait a minute. Don't you want to know, after all, the notorious eighth clue? He said, and leaned down beside his desk. Through a cardboard box he pulled out the phone device. The telephone, gentlemen. The old man used to make up his mind and challenge you when he got drunk, or at least, so he wanted you to believe. He told you once that the eighth clue would be found if you could call the police from this device. Of course, the number never changed, however, to call us from this phone, no 1911. This I am sure you did not understand in your drunkenness. The board's been tampered with. You press another number for 1 and another number for 9. From another cardboard box lifted the mattress cover with the dozens of patches. And not to forget the number, he had marked it up here. A patch for every step in the clearing. 233 steps, he said, and let the cover fall into the box. When the door closed, behind the last policeman, in his mind he still had the last words he had exchanged with Semyonov that day. He was provoking them, master, provoking them. Whoever sleeps with me tonight will know the eighth clue. He'll see the steps in the clearing, he would say, and they would pass him by for such, and sour their faces, master. And why did you call the police? Why did you shoot in the air? I would not let injustice pass thus, master. Sooner or later, even if you didn't understand me, I was going to confess everything. Semis knew about sweets. He had made up his mind and no one knew. He had chosen to die. You didn't answer why you shot in the air. That's how they greet heroes when they die, and enemies too.